Welcome to the Journey Podcast, a show about health, wealth, and happiness. My name is Adam Bruderly, and I am joined by my co-host, Michael Baker. Whether you're looking to revamp your lifestyle or seeking a spark of inspiration, join us on this journey and let's explore the world your health and wealth make possible.
All opinions expressed by Adam and Michael and any podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinions of Journey Wealth. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon for any health or financial decisions.
Welcome to the Journey Podcast. Today we are joined by Drew Brush. Drew is a founder of multiple companies, a dedicated therapist in his past, executive coach, husband, parent, runner, and ironically, someone that grew up very close to me that we didn't even know each other. Drew, thanks for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Man, there's a lot of titles in there. Yeah.
But you're important.
Oh, no, I don't know about that. Yeah, put them all together. I know it's funny, just having all those identities together to hear them out loud. You don't normally do that for yourself. So thanks for the introduction. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, thanks so much for joining me today. Really appreciate it. I think based upon your background, we'll probably really get into a number of different areas.
Sure.
But I really would like to start with your story, getting a little bit of background. So could you share, how that intersection came together, your background in psychology and therapy and now in executive coaching and leadership?
Yeah, I will challenge myself to be concise here because there's a long story there, but I definitely give you the highlights. So I got interested in being what I call myself to kind of put all those titles together and being a helper, right? So I just kind of wanted to help people. And I realized that pretty young. I think I was in maybe high school or so, and I had these experiences where I found people felt really comfortable confiding in me or telling me their story. And I remember at the time being super interested in other people. I'm like, what is your story? And what are you challenged with? And what are you struggling with? And then I didn't really have the tools to help people. And so, as I got older and you start thinking about a career, I got interested in what are the places where you can learn how to help people? And that kind of naturally led to psychology and, psychology, particularly at the time I was studying, if you enter into it, you basically go down a path towards mental health. And so I started to volunteer and work in the mental health industry. Mental health settings. So suicide prevention, for example, I answered a volunteer hotline for years, which had a big impact on how I understood people and how to help them. And from there, I started to get interested in becoming a clinician. When you're an undergrad, you can kind of go PhD, academic, or kind of go applied when it comes to mental health. Got into the applied route, became a therapist. But that was amazing work, and we could talk more about later if we want to, but I also realized that the systems I was working in as a therapist were also, I won't say broken, but definitely weren't working as good as they could be. And so that got me super interested in who runs these systems, right? People obviously making decisions that influence how stuff gets done and services get delivered. And that naturally led me to leadership. And so I was fortunate enough to kind of stumble into a consulting firm that did leadership development, had a strong background in psychology as well. And I guess from there I ended up in the world of leadership development and many other things after that. Worked in startups, worked consulting Fortune 500 specifically most of the time when I was in consulting. And that led to me wanting to found my own businesses that could do this work, and I would have more autonomy over shaping how I think I could help people.
Oh, great. I appreciate the context. I mean, that's pretty incredible. I mean, the work that you have done in what you just shared, right? There's probably a lot to unpack there. I'd love to touch on it a little bit more here as we move forward. But I want to go back to one thing you referenced, right? And what I mean by that is you touched on the clinician going through it, living in it, and then you said, hey, the system, right, wasn't a great fit, for lack of a better term. We had a precision health doctor on last time, and he touched on a very similar story, right? Working in the large system. I think for doctors, 75% of all physicians work in a large healthcare system now, right? So when you think about that other 25% and where they live, could you go back to that and how you felt or recognized that sitting within it? And then when you stepped outside, how did you take what you learned and bring that into what you're doing now?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. So like when I think about, if I put myself back to, okay, I'm this clinician and where was I at EFABO? I think it's helpful to have a picture of this. So I'm sitting in either an inpatient, full hospitalization setting where people are coming in where they have severe psychiatric disorders or diseases, we would say, so schizophrenia, so they may be actively hallucinating. Or I was also working in community crisis centers where people are coming in who need short-term stabilization, meaning they need a place 24/7 to be around because they were so suicidal that they felt they would harm themselves if they didn't have somebody actively supporting them. Or they were addicted to, back then, like the opiate crisis wasn't as well known, right? So they're addicted to opiates typically, or, had alcohol, et cetera. So like you're in these people are at their very low, right? At the same time, you're there to help people. It's like the most obvious sense of where you want to support a human. Like they're at their lowest low and we want to support you. And the systems, to a certain degree, facilitated that. But at other degrees, and concretely, as an example, is like, your time ran up, right? It's like about 3 days. It's like, you can only pay for so much, how much funding comes from the state. Here's what the insurance will pay. We got to move you on and we got to figure out how to do that, which may or may not align with your growth path or like your coming back to healthy. Right. And so I was like, this makes no sense. Like, why are we treating sort of like individuals' needs separate from, like aligned with this other problem of like, this is the way the system has to run. So I don't know if that answers your question directly, but like to me though, that was a lot of the problem. So then the second part of your question about us was, well, what do you learn to do about that? Right. And so, I took away from that if you truly understand people and their problems, you're probably pretty motivated to help them. A lot of the problem was people were further removed from actually understanding the implications of this. And so that's why, again, I got into leadership, because I think leaders and people generally are fundamentally good. And if they can understand the implications of the decisions they're making and be focused on the right ways to deliver these systems, we can make changes, right? So I took all those lessons and put them into how do I think about developing leaders, like what's important for them to be thinking about.
Yeah, that provides really good context. And I think you segued it perfectly into where I was hoping to take it, right? Because what you guys are doing now at your firms, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of it is leadership development. Yeah. Leadership development at the C-suite level, mm-hmm. leadership development across an organization, and how they go about that in terms of impacting their business or impacting themselves. Could you kind of open the door a little bit on what your team and your firm is doing now?
Yeah. So if you could think about the leadership development aspect of what we do today. First of all, there's a lot in there. So leaders need a lot of competencies to run a business. And so we're going from these experiences, zooming up here to what do leaders need today. But what we do basically is partner with organizations to understand what competencies their leaders need in order to run the business of the future. Ideally, of the future, in the current moment, you might be struggling with some things as well, but some of the best organizations we work with are looking towards like, where do we need to develop? They've probably gotten to some level of success based on where they're at currently. And more, the way we have experienced this and see this, we know there's more demands on leaders today. So those demands, for example, are like, hey, you need to, even if you just take your manager, take the C-suite over a second. It's like people expect their manager to even help them with like personal challenges, not just, assign my work and figure out the capacity, et cetera. So our philosophy and our approach is to understand first the goals or the purpose of the business, right? And then also to figure out how do you help them grow towards achieving that purpose. But this third component that's really important is how the mattering of people inside of your goals and your growth intersect. Because people, you can take away people and you don't have business, right? Like you have to fundamentally recognize that, and I think most people do, that as an individual, as a leader, your ability to fundamentally understand a human across from you, to influence them, to connect with them, is probably the most important skill that you have.
Yeah. I mean, there's two words you mentioned right there, goals and growth, that I really pulled out. And meaning, when you think about that in that intersection of leadership development, coaching, personal development, and you then layer on your background, which I think is very unique. You know, there's a lot of people in the industry, whether it's in, you know, leadership development, executive coaching, consulting, that, right, they have that certain skill set. But what I think you bring in is very unique is that background that you just shared, right? How many other leadership development team members have spent time on a suicide hotline,
right? Yeah.
In a group home or an outpatient or an inpatient facility? There's a lot there. You know, how is that intersected, right, in terms of pulling those things together?
Yeah. By the way, I encourage anybody who wants to do some of those things. Those are volunteer opportunities, and they're a great way to give back and also to learn a lot about yourself. So you can volunteer you go through training and you get support you learn some great skill sets on answering the suicide prevention hotline. So got to plug that a little bit as a big part of my life. But yeah, so the background in the psychology, so let me say this first. I'm just interested. I'm very curious and I'm interested in learning. And the reason why I have that background, why I have those experiences, is because I wanted to find out what is the best known information we have on how people are and who they are, right? And so, like, I won't bore you with the other parts where I'm more informally educated in philosophy and other areas that I get super interested in. But the way that I think you're right, is probably unique. I don't run into a lot of clinicians who are doing what I do. But I also want to make it accessible in the sense that it's just really truly understanding people and being in front of somebody and trying to understand the humanity of the person in front of you. So, for example, you know, as a clinician, you learn all these and, you know, schools of thought on how people are. And I'm sure, you know, listeners understand the history. There's like psychoanalytics, and currently we have very heavy influence from cognitive behavioral, and those things all matter, but all what they are a body of science trying to approximate to an understanding of who we are as people. And, you know, recently we just had a great scientist pass away, Daniel Kahneman, who helped us understand, like, how do people think, right? And an ability to sit across, the direct answer to this is from somebody and look at them and think about how this person might be, to put myself in their shoes and understand that all these things influence them, the understanding of the science behind them. And that is what's, I guess, helpful or unique, to be interested in how do people work. Yeah.
Do you think what you just shared, right? How do people work? Is that the number one skill you think leaders need?
Yeah. I think an ability to genuinely connect and understand people is, it'll be hard to pin me down. I'm a coach to just one specific thing. You have to have that only. But yeah, I think that's top of the list. Like, you should be able to understand people, right? I'll make a case for this, a little stronger case for it. I'll take one skill everybody typically kind of knows about, or I would say think they know about: empathy. So empathy sort of gets lumped in with this idea of like a squishiness, like it's just, I care about you, which, by the way, that's important. The squishiness, I'm very happy with. But empathy is a very specific skill. So very famously, you know, Paul Bloom, who's a great psychologist anyone's ever heard of, wrote a book about the case against empathy, where he was arguing that, you know, like you even have people who are sociopaths who might be actually pretty good at being empathetic as a tool of influence. So why do I point to that specifically? So as a leader, if you understand that there's these tools and these skills behind how you understand people, I don't, want you to be a sociopath, but I want you to understand it's possible to learn multiple sets of skills that allow you to better understand people. That means you're better able to influence. That means you're better able to understand problems, because typically a lot of the problems we see, you can have technical problems, but organizations typically struggle with collaboration and problems of people, as much as they do technical problems. So I put it high on my list. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about it in that way, right? Yeah. There's a study, I know there a paper that came out a while back, and it was from it was a Harvard case study, and I'm sure you're very familiar with this, right? But it said the number one skill set for leaders in the future, right, the C-suite level, was emotional intelligence.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and a huge part of that, and Gartner just published something recently as well, is that leaders today, like I think it was something like 75% of them will say they're good at that, generally speaking. But the evidence on the HR side would say actually they're not. So there's a self-awareness gap. So that's an emotional intelligence skill, right? So people think that they kind of understand those skills. And the reason why I, in this conversation, also focus on skills is part of what I do is really focus on putting them into practice. So a lot of this, and why I kind of shy away from a lot of the theory on the psychology that's super interesting, super important, is getting to the applied part. It's like, can you actually show me in a conversation the ability to do these things, and what does it look like? Because we spend a lot of time discussing and thinking about what these things are. But we could spend a lot more time actually putting them into practice and like being with each other and doing it rather than just sort of discussing it. I think that's one of the gaps I see when it comes to building emotional intelligence in leaders, is that people think they've understood it because they've heard so much about it, but very little have we practiced like putting it into actual, applied settings.
Implementation.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. Which is not as, it's in some ways it's more fun to discuss the theory and do the thing. It's hard. It's hard work to sit down to practice, to get feedback on like, hey, you weren't listening to that person. Hey, did you notice that like they said this thing was like super important to them, and then you didn't acknowledge it all and you moved on and asked your question or whatever. Like there's so many things you can do to get better at it, but yeah, like we're not practicing it enough. I would at least make a case that we're not practicing it enough today.
So when you think about that term practice and you actually implement it, love to hear you share some examples actually personally of how you've implemented some of that to get where you are. And two, when you guys actually go out and work with clients and other leaders, what does that really mean? I think that's a great term. Yeah. I don't think it gets used enough. My young kids both play sports. They're very young. They're 9 and 6. And I think about youth sports today. And I promise I'll pull this back, but I think about youth sports today, and youth sports tend to anchor towards, playing a lot of games, right? Like if you think about travel baseball, other, AAU basketball, right? They're playing week in and week out every evening. And then it leaves a tremendous gap for practice. Same in the NBA, when you hear a lot of NBA players, for example, talk about it, right? They're on the road every week. MLB, there's not a ton of time for practice. And does that degrade the skill set? Does that not give them a chance to experiment, try new things? So could you touch on that? I know I've kind of packed a lot in, but I thought that was a good example of, that disconnect in terms of practice and what it can do for people personally and or professionally. Yeah,
absolutely. And then, practice is a part of learning. And I focus on that in practice because it's the part we tend to focus on. But just one quick step, I'll zoom out and I'll zoom back in. Because you zoom out, what's really important, and this is the way I see like businesses help improve their outcomes the most, as well as individuals, is that they're great at learning, right? So oftentimes when, we work with a group of leaders and they're challenged with something, there's this piece they might want to practice a skill like emotional intelligence and learn it. And like I just said, that's very important. But overall, they might actually just need to focus on learning more. And how do you do that? So, when it comes to learning the basic steps, and this is super well established, and also how we understand the brain works when it comes to neuroscience. And it's just like you do some kind of action in the world, right? You have a feedback channel to that. That's important. You need to know, like, how did that thing go? And an important step that can be missed, and directly related to what you were just saying, is then you make some kind of reflection or elaboration on what that feedback meant. If you're only going, and you're not taking a reflective stance, or in some cases specifically a recovery stance, you haven't learned yet, because you will just repeat the same action without making a different course correction, right? And typically, if you practice something enough, what we know will happen in our neurobiology is it'll become automatic, or a practiced behavior that you don't think that much about. So it's effortful at first, and then it gets easier. The thing I like to say on this is like, you're learning whether or not you want to or not, so you might as well be intentional. So it's not that it's just being intentional around that process of learning, right? So today, it's like people aren't as intent, would make us something like emotional intelligence or understanding people as a leader. Like you're practicing some other skills all the time, or you probably put some things on autopilot. You might need to change some of those or understand whether they're really, truly still working for you as best as they could.
That's really great. I mean, I think that is something I try to apply into my own personal life.
Yeah.
Learning, curiosity, growth, right? A topic you and I have touched on quite a bit in our conversations and interactions.
Yeah. I didn't answer your question, by the way, about what do I do? But
I was going to that next, I swear.
Yeah.
Was to kind of pivot back, right? Like I apply those personal things, or at least I try to.
Yeah.
You know, love to hear again what you do.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I try to do, let's first note that I try to, but that doesn't mean I'm doing it perfectly every time. I'm definitely not. And that's one lesson I learned early, right? I'm trying all the time to be as curious and also as humble as possible about my understanding of anything. And so I feel like naturally I'm a little bit that way, and that helps, but specifically in things that I do. So starting a business, co-founding a business, there's like skills I had to learn that I didn't have before, that I said, like selling, right? Like, how do you do that? How do you go out and acquire customers and the right customers that you want? How do you do that? Like, I had some experience as somebody who was working in businesses and managing large accounts and whatnot, which have some overlap. By the way, I think, some of the background skills I have in psychology have a huge overlap in the ability to do these things. But, the way I also looked at it, I was like, I've never done this before. I need to start from zero and understand, like, what do the best people who are in sales do? So that's what I did. And what we did, and we go in, I talked to them, interviewed them. I read as much as I could. I started practicing things, what worked for me. And then we walk the walk. We also said, like, what's our learning? So we literally write like hypothesis about, like, we think if we do this, this will happen towards our goal. And then we go and test it and try to experience it. And we go, we can look for the feedback. Like, did it go that way? Oh, no, it didn't. Why? We have a new hypothesis, and we adjust and continue to iterate until we get to an outcome. So I do it on things all the time, but recently for me, like sales is a good example. But anything that's important to me that I want to learn and try to get better at, I take a learning stance, basically.
That's great. I mean, the sales part is a really good example. And I would kind of step back a little bit and ask this question. You've referenced a lot of, thinkers, experts, people who provide context and insights, people you have tapped into. Looking back, who are those top 2 or 3 people you've really pulled a lot of or leaned into for that learning and then implemented that into what you're doing?
That's a challenging question because there's so many people that I feel have influenced me. But probably relevant to me as a helper, as I was talking about earlier, there's a few key figures. And I'm, by the way, very fortunate enough to have actually met them. So I'll start with, so one branch of psychology I'm highly influenced by is something called like humanism. So humanistic psychology. And there everyone typically knows the name Maslow. So I think Maslow is brilliant in terms of understanding the core of some of who we are as being motivated towards what we do. I'm super lucky to have also met sort of the modern day Maslow, Scott Barry Kaufman, who wrote a book called Transcend, I think in like 2020, that modernized our understanding of what Maslow was saying and also what the current science says about what he got right or what he didn't. Side note to that, which I want to help rectify, Maslow never created the pyramid. So everyone thinks about him he created those concepts, but a management consultant put them into a pyramid. I'm
not shocked,
yeah,
right? Because
exactly,
it sells really well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's like, that's great. You go up. So anyway, so that whole school of thought, because that to me, the core idea of that being people fundamentally want to get better and grow and go towards these experiences, and they just need help or support getting there potentially. And then the second one I'll say quickly is David Rosengren and motivational interviewing, which is an approach and where you can help people get to where they're going, is actually something we teach leaders as well, particularly if they're resistant. So people have been in a situation you're trying to influence somebody, there's some change going on, and if you tell somebody to do something, people are going to probably do the opposite or not want to do it because they're told to do it. So it's a set of skills and approaches around how you can help call forth somebody's individual motivations to allow them to get to the place that they need to get.
That's great. The Maslow thing, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But again, when you think about that space and how you put things out, right? Visualization, what sells, what doesn't sell, makes a lot of sense. One thing you did mention, I think it's really interesting, is growth. And you mentioned that earlier. It's been kind of consistent throughout our conversation. And you said everybody has a desire for growth. Mm-hmm. And then I look at the environment we're in now. Mm-hmm. right? And one thing we talk about at our firm, Journey Wealth, is the 4 pillars of wellness: mental, physical, spiritual, and financial. And if you think about those 4 pillars, right, and you look across and you see where they fit in people's lives and all the tools and resources that are out there to achieve, for lack of a better term, success in those pillars. But we look at the environment again we're in. Mentally, if you look statistically, we could kind of sit and trade data back and forth. The environment is tough right now for a lot of people.
All right.
Spiritually, whatever that form of spirituality is, I talk a lot about purpose and why. But even if you look at like religion, a lot of those things, statistically, all those numbers have plummeted, each across the board. So when you step back and you look at that, looking at it the lens of both a therapist and a coach, where is the friction? Why, what is the environment like, and why are, so many people struggling in a lot of those spaces? And then how would you take that back, or how do you, when you untap those friction issues with people, what are you starting to tell them to remove that friction?
Yep. Oh boy. Okay. So this is like my binder.
Sorry, it's a lot there.
Yeah, no, it's okay. It's good. It's interesting. I think it's a question also we should all be asking ourselves all the time. So part of my answer, which is a bit of a non-answer, is like, I don't know, because it's this complex confluence of things. But that's also part of my answer. Like, we need to understand there's lots of different variables that influence things. And so we need to prioritize what are the problems we need to solve inside of that as a society, and then attack those. And then there's also the individual, which is a little bit different. So there's different levels you can approach the problem. So let me take it from the individual first. When it comes to the individual, I think your point is something super important that's underappreciated often, is the degree to which you have personal agency and responsibility over your life versus the degree to which the circumstances you're in. This comes up all the time. Right now, it's a popular book out on free will by Robert Sapolsky, for example, right, is in the ethos. Despite any of those philosophical questions, the practical questions for an individual are basically, how self-aware are you? So like when I'm working with people, sometimes people are aware of these challenges or cause of these challenges. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're in a world of suffering and or challenge or whatever, an undesirable state they want to change, a status quo, and they're uncertain as to why they're in it and or whether or not they have control over it or how they got there. And so step 1 typically for an individual is like self-awareness. Where are we? Like, what is the challenge? Where am I at? And then step 2 is the more what can I do about it? And there, the problem I see isn't that we don't have good answers for some of that. It's that the implementation and the practice is hard. And people, one of the challenges I think we see today that feeds a lot of this is it requires work and time, and it's not an instant gratification experience, right? And so I think that feeds a lot of the challenges we see today, is that instant gratification driven by faster and faster social media, et cetera, like that becomes problematic to people's growth or ability to move forward because they have expectations that aren't matching the action they put in. On the society level, I don't know if I can, I will say like on a larger level that one, from the bottom up, we should all acknowledge some of the things I just said. On the society level, I will put it as simply as this: if we can figure out how to be better with each other, I think we need to be able to have the conversations to practice the emotional intelligence. That's going to go a long way. Like, why can't we sit across from people we disagree with and talk for a long period of time, even if we end up at a place of disagreement? I think you don't see that very often. Like, I think you see a lot of people go to their corners and they're polarized wherever. Political, it doesn't even matter, politically, anything. Like, almost all areas, we see very like fragmented, in-grouped, biased people. Myself, by the way, acknowledge our response, myself included. I need to figure out when am I in my in-group and get outside of that and make contact with the out-group. So I think maybe that's a tough answer, but basically we should be better with each other.
No, it's a tough question. It's a lot to ask. I think the personal piece was good. I think touching on it from a bigger picture, I think provides some good context too, right? Because, it's the idea of, we want to see the forest through the trees, but when we're walking through the forest, you're still taking it step by step.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I want to pull it back because there's a lot of things you just shared kind of throughout our conversation. And I want to bring it back to, that idea of coaching, executives, leadership. Mm-hmm. When you think about that, because again, at our firm, we do work with a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of executives.
Yep.
When you think about, tapping into that potential and that growth, what are some, 2 or 3 things that you really touch on in a conversation with someone, or you can say, hey, these are kind of some simple steps you can start to take to really unlock that growth and that potential personally, or perhaps even in your organization?
Yeah. Well, I've mentioned a couple like self-awareness. Are you aware of even where you want to grow? Right. Are you clear about sort of the things, the purpose? So you're self-aware, you have a clear direction and aim, basically. And the third is like, how are you getting there? You have learning science and practicing. But I want to, if I can I give a short story, a very short story here on this? So, because it's helpful when these things are concrete, I think. So there was one leader that I was working with, and they were a senior executive in an extremely large organization. I think they had maybe responsible for around 10,000 people under them, right? And they, following this pattern of self-awareness, weren't as aware of somehow their behaviors and how they were impacting people around them. And is this a family show? Am I able to curse? I don't know if I'm, a curse might come out.
We can always use, we can use the bleep if needed.
I'll bleep it. All right. So, because, and the reason why I say that is like, I was in this practice moment, right? And so it was, in this case, it was a simulation, a very high realistic role play. And this person was trying to negotiate in an influencing conversation, another business leader. And because of this person's conflict oriented that they've had for a very long time, they would escalate these conversations. And so we escalated him to the point where we were literally standing like over the table, and he was like, don't point at me. And I was like, I'll point at you as all I want, because I'm in a role play, right? But this is very real for them. And he got so angry that he got up, he went and he tried to leave the room. He went to slam it. And when he went to go slam, it was like one of those like pneumatic doors, so he couldn't slam it. And in that moment, I saw him, he saw me like out of character. And like in that moment, I saw his self-awareness come on, right? So I go get him in the hallway. By the way, his boss and his boss's boss were observing this, and he was being rated on it. And so this was a very real performance moment for it. Got him in the hallway, and attitude totally changed. And he said, the first thing he said to me, I saw him, I came up to him, I was like, hey man, how you doing? He was like, I do this. He goes, I do this, and I do it to he said family first. He goes, I do this to my family. I do this to, and so to make that concrete, like that moment of self-awareness, really challenge yourself. Do you have it? And he was willing to put himself in a situation where he's trying to practice and getting better, and he got feedback, and it meant something, right? And like, so that's the way it comes to life in a way, if that's helpful.
No, that's one incredible story, right? For someone to have that recognition at that time, whether you want to call it an inflection point, whether you want to call it a tipping point, I'm sure it is one both in their personal and professional life, as you just referenced.
Yeah.
That someone would come to that conclusion. And I think, I personally think about my own experiences and when has that come forward?
Yeah.
I talk on here a lot about endurance athletics. It's a passion of mine. Mm-hmm. And you have those similar experiences, right? Putting yourself in those moments that you can learn and walk away from. In a long race, which we'll touch on here a little bit at the end, it's 2 a.m. It's pitch black out. You're exhausted. You haven't eaten. It was hot. You're dehydrated. You're out there. You're sleep deprived. And you're like, what am I doing? Like, why am I out here? What am I doing? And you're ready for a full-blown meltdown. A friend of mine was pacing me for the last 20 miles of 100, probably 5 or 6 years ago. And I don't think I said a word to him for about 11 straight miles.
Mm-hmm.
He talked to me and I did not respond.
Yeah.
And you're thinking to yourself, like, finally I came out of it, whatever the stupor was. And you're like, what was I doing? Right? Like, what did I learn from that?
Yeah.
Thinking about it after. And it was like a clicking point for me of, for the next one and the next one of, hey, here's what the experience is. You've been here before. What can I learn from that?
Yeah.
And it sounds, that's my own analogy for what you just shared, right?
Yeah.
But, personally or on someone else, right? Those are the experiences that pull you ahead and unlock that growth.
Yeah. It takes a place you got to be vulnerable to get there too. You got to be willing to put yourself in that position to do it. So, it's interesting. If you can find those moments of where you can challenge yourself, that's, I think, where a lot of the gold is when it comes to growth. And I see often for people, whether it was clinical or leadership, some people at some point, the cost of their pain gets so high that they have to get out and go towards it. And I think ultimately that's why people are oriented to growth. But proactively, if you can invest in yourself in those ways, it's like the return on investment's massive. You're just like, they compound. So it's like a flywheel of getting better and better and better when you challenge yourself those ways. Yeah, agreed.
And I know from a coaching perspective or a consulting perspective, you guys do a lot of role play with executives. And as you just shared that story,
Yeah.
you know, you mentioned something just now, people finding a way to put themselves in those positions. And I think about, for example, again, another analogy, but how do they, finding the way to put themselves in those positions with the right safety nets and cords around them, right?
Yep.
Think about Free Solo and Alex Honnold. The number of times he did that climb with a rope on before he did it free solo, which is a whole nother level of risk.
Yeah.
But how do you talk to people about finding those opportunities or finding those situations or those examples to put themselves in, to push themselves to the right red line so that they can learn from those lessons and then bring them back when they go into there? Yeah.
Well, and you said, so a lot of it's like, so there's calculated risk involved and there's also safety nets. You want to find yourself in a place where you can, there's enough skin in the game that a failure will teach you something, but not so much that it's going to devastate you, right? So I'm not advocating, for example, that, like the example I gave you, the story just a minute ago, there's a lot of conversation up front about like what we're going to do. And we tell you it's going to be challenging, even though people don't necessarily believe it till they experience it. And there's a lot of support that happens afterwards, right? So I think, it's exactly that. It's like, where can you take a risk intelligently in order to grow? You don't go stake everything on one thing just to find out if you learned. I think the real challenge though is I don't think we're at risk generally when we talk about these experiences of taking too much risk. I think we're more in the other space. Like I think the pendulum's more that we need to swing more towards embracing being vulnerable and taking those risks. I don't see a lot of people making the mistake of like, I want to learn how to fly a plane. I'll just go try to fly one. Like the human nature, I think often isn't that in general overall, but safety and taking risk is important. Yeah.
Yeah. And I want to tap into a little bit more about just your personal side too. You've shared, I think your journey from, volunteering and sharing just with friendships and learning what was important to you. And then your experience within the therapy space and really kind of getting very deep into people's lives and what they go through. And then pivoting that into a large organization and being yourself a leader. And then now moving into being a founder, consulting with, Fortune 100 type companies and executives making massive decisions, probably personally and professionally. What has that done for you specifically? How has that impacted your life? How has that changed your life and how you experience, the things you want to do, what you're looking to become?
It's a good question. I would take a second and think about it. I think it's a good question. Here's the number one lesson that I learned, and then I'll tell you how that applies to me. People are people. Meaning, I would use the jokes I'd like, went from the street to the boardroom, right? Or a bad Maslow joke, I went from the bottom of the hierarchy to the top, right? But what I found in all my experiences is that we're all people. We're all trying to navigate this world. We put mythos around people. Oh, they're a big, powerful executive, or they're a down and out drug addict. They're humans. There's a lot of beauty, a lot of humanity in the experiences that I had with people who are struggling with addiction. And, there's a lot of humbleness and vulnerability I've seen with high powered executives, as you can call them. For me, how that's impacted my life is like, hey, I'm a human. Like I one, a little bit of more self-compassion, the more I see other people struggle with things. Another is try to, as best as I can, have a lower ego. Like this isn't about, I feel much better when it's not just about me, it's about other people. I'm not perfect in that. And I recognize that. Hopefully that comes across, because it's like, that's something I need to think about every day, but that I do, I genuinely think about that every day. Like, am I doing this for me or somebody else, and why? What's the intention behind it? And it's okay to do things for yourself, right? But being in contact, it's allowed me to be in contact with my humanity and what I'm actually trying to achieve in life more easily, I think.
Yeah, it's really thoughtful. I think about it, or, in our own practice at the firm in coaching, just to kind of break it down a little bit, even simpler as resume virtues, eulogy virtues.
Yeah.
I talk a lot about that. And I think you just referenced that, especially when you think about executives and in those space.
Yep.
I think as a society and individually, a lot of people associate their self-worth with accomplishments.
Yes. Yep.
Hey, I'm the vice president of some esoteric division of some company that may or may not be here in 25, 30, 50 years.
Yep.
I earn this, I have this house, this car, right? Whatever it is, like it's that component. And I think what you just shared is getting down, and when you take all of that away and strip it away, it's like, what is that story? Who are you?
And that's why self-awareness and intention are so important, because there are people, it could be highly meaningful for somebody to have that title in a way that's actually fulfilling. It can also be true that somebody went on autopilot the whole career and didn't give a shit about that title. You know what I mean? Like, and they got it and it was deeply unfulfilling. And then it's because it started with that thing I said before, self-awareness and intention. Like, were you aware, like, of what you were trying to do? So yeah, I agree. And you see it a lot. I see it, honestly, I see it a lot in coaching and in therapy. People went down a route that they didn't intend.
As we, start to come to the conclusion of the conversation, there's a few things you've mentioned: self-awareness, empathy, a number of different topics. Yeah. When you think about, for anyone listening, what are 2 or 3 of those that they could implement or take away from this conversation and really start to kind of reflect upon into their own life?
So some actually very simple things it's important. If you kind of follow along this far and you kind of buy into, like, this is important to be self-aware, to be intentional, to be better with other people. The things that you hear all the time about practice actually matter. So here's a really simple, easy one. I don't know. Do you journal? Do you write down your thoughts, or do you even take time to stop and think, what am I doing? So I've seen people do very simple behaviors like, I'm going to set a timer that reminds me for a 10-minute period of time, even if I don't write, that I literally intentionally think about how was my day? Like, is this where I wanted to do? Like, how am I feeling in this moment, and checking in. So I would stack, behaviors and habits that allow you to build up muscles that help you do these things called self-awareness. And you can ask ChatGPT 15 of them and they will pop out, right? Like, and journal, times. There's a lot of different things you can do. The thing I would say is try, like, make an attempt to try and figure out, is it working for you? Learn, just try.
Yeah. Start to stack small wins.
Yeah. Stack small wins, make an effort and try and find out, is it working for you? Learn, right? I think stop thinking about it and try to do it, right? Thinking's a good first step, but a lot of time we spend a lot of time, and also make a small commitment. You don't have to build a massive, it's hard to make a huge change overnight. It's just, small wins to try something, right? Stay on course. Ask yourself the question, why do I want to do these things?
Yeah, again, back to the 4 pillars: financial wellness, compounding interest, 1%, right?
Mm-hmm,
Getting 1% better. And that leads me to a question that I ask. Again, I love the book, The Comfort Crisis. It's one of my favorite. Michael Easter's work is fantastic. Yeah. We defined the term in a couple episodes, but kick it back to a misogi, something really big on the horizon. And I want to pivot that back to you. Your story is very unique. There's very few people, like we said at the beginning, that have the background you have. And I think you and I talk a lot about personal growth. So I would like to kick it back and just ask you, like, what's on the horizon for you from a misogi perspective, something really big you want to do?
I might have to blame you for part of it. So I've been a runner my whole life. I've done a handful of marathons, but I've committed to do an ultra marathon this summer. So I've been training for that, and I'll be honest, it's a bit scary. It's a 100-mile race, and I'm like, I'm going to make that attempt. And I know it's, I'm going to finish at some point, and I just want to go after and figure it out. I want to see what my limit is. So.
Well, I always tell people in conversations, in coaching sessions, when the analogy presents itself or presents the opportunity to share it, that run or that distance is like a snapshot of life in a 24 or 36 hour window. The highs, the lows, the preparation, the experiences, the emotions. You kind of go through it all in one big washing machine type cycle time frame. And I think whether you finish or do finish, there's so much to learn from the actual experience itself. I selfishly asked you that question. I will be out there helping crew you for that, which I'm really looking forward to. And I want to close with a few other items. One, tell us a little bit about your companies, your firm, how they can find you. And then, also would love to hear, a few kind of closing items that you'd like to leave the listeners with.
Yeah. So, easiest way to find me is probably on LinkedIn, at Andrew Brush. So I go by Drew and Andrew, but Andrew Brush on LinkedIn. And the firm that I co-founded, it's called PBJ, People Consulting and Coaching. I have 3 other amazing partners. 2 are former executives. One with United Health Group. The other was the chief strategy officer at Intel. And my 3rd executive came from executive education at Stanford. And so we spend our time, like I said, helping leaders improve their competencies so that you can really impact your bottom line in your business. But that's where I would point you, is really to my LinkedIn. If you're interested in having one of these conversations, I'm more than happy to have them anytime. And then the thing I would just leave people with is, hope it doesn't sound repetitive, but I genuinely mean them. The self-awareness is important, super important to know how to learn. Don't underestimate the power of measuring how fast you're learning rather than how much you're getting done. And if we can all kind of commit to being better with each other, I think we could all say that's a good civic duty, that we should all be invested in figuring out how to become better with each other. And if I think people get away with that walk away with that, I'd be more than happy if that's something people agree with.
I think that's a great way to close the conversation, the line. I could sit here all day with you. I really appreciate you joining us. Thanks for coming on.
Oh, I appreciate it. Yeah, thanks for the invite.
And join us next time. We'll have Sarah Saunders joining us for the next episode of the Journey podcast. Appreciate it. Take care.
Thanks, Alan.